I stood there frozen, the invitation still clutched in my shaking hand as applause echoed behind the ballroom doors. My son's voice rang in my ears like ice. "Mom, it's better if you don't come. You won't fit in with the guests." Guests. After scrubbing his uniforms, skipping meals so he could eat, and building every step he ever took, I wasn't a guest. I was the foundation. He just didn't know they invited me as the guest of honor. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The dryer buzzed like a tired alarm clock, its metallic hum filling Marla Green's small laundry room. She pulled out a bundle of still warm towels, their faint lavender scent clinging to her hands, and shook them loose with practiced efficiency. The rhythm of folding, the soft slap of fabric against the counter, had always calmed her. It was one of those rituals of quiet survival, mundane, grounding, hers. The phone rang from the kitchen, a brisk, insistent tone. Marla tucked a corner of terry cloth into a neat square before reaching for it. "Hello?" Her son's voice, polished yet oddly tentative, slid through the line. "Hey, Mom." Something in the way he said it, too careful, like a salesman easing into bad news, made her chest tighten. "Hi, Dylan," she said, keeping her tone light. "You sound busy." "Yeah, always." "Listen." He paused, clearing his throat. "About the promotion party next week." Her heart skipped. She hadn't been invited yet, but she'd imagined it. Her son being celebrated, surrounded by people in press suits. Her standing quietly in the back, smiling. She waited. "I think it's better if you don't come." The towels in her hands stilled. Dylan pressed on quickly, like ripping off a bandage. "It's not that I don't want you there, it's just the crowd's, very high level. Investors, board members, clients, people who expect a certain kind of presentation. You'd be out of place, Mom. It might make things awkward." His words fell with a precision that felt rehearsed. Marla leaned against the counter, pressing the folded towel flat with her palm. Out of place. She thought of the nights scrubbing classrooms until her knees gave out. Of the years she juggled 3 jobs so her son could have clean shoes, a full backpack, a chance. She didn't say any of it. Instead, she inhaled through her nose, held the breath, and let it out slow. "Of course," she said softly. Dylan sounded relieved, as though he'd passed a difficult exam. "Thanks for understanding. It's just, you know how these things are." She pictured him, pacing in some glass-walled office with a Bluetooth in his ear, hair trimmed sharp, suit crisp, a man who never carried the scent of bleach or the ache of double shifts. A man who had forgotten the sound of coins being counted at midnight to make rent. "Yes," she answered, folding another towel with steady hands. "I know how these things are." "Good, I'll call you soon." "Okay, love you." And then, before she could gather a response, the line clicked dead. The silence was heavier than any slammed door. Marla stood for a long moment in the small room, the dryer cooling behind her, the folded towels stacked like white bricks of memory. She set the phone down carefully, as if it might shatter. Then, without really thinking, she pressed it against her chest, not to hold on, but to steady herself against the hollowness that rushed in. Her throat burned, but no tears came. She had spent a lifetime learning how not to cry where anyone could see. The clock above the washer ticked. A truck rattled past on the street. The world, as always, kept moving. But Marla's world had shifted by inches, and inches could turn into miles. She smoothed the last towel, stacked it neatly, and carried the pile to the hallway linen closet. As she slid the door shut, she caught her reflection in the glass. Hair streaked with silver, shoulders squared, eyes fierce despite the ache beneath them. She whispered to the woman staring back at her. "Out of place, huh?" Her lips curved, not in a smile, but in something harder. A thought rising, uninvited but undeniable. If her son believed she didn't belong in his world, then he had no idea how wrong he was. The next morning, Marla carried a basket of clipped roses from her garden into the kitchen, their petals loosening in the Texas heat. She set them on the table, trimming stems with a pair of dull scissors, when the doorbell rang. The sound startled her. It was rare anyone came unannounced. On the porch stood a woman in a slate gray blazer, her posture crisp but her eyes warm. She carried a folder tucked under her arm and introduced herself before Marla could ask. Elena Ward. I'm the HR director at Halston Consulting. Marla blinked, wiping her hands on her apron. You must be looking for Dylan. He's not here. I'm not here for him, Elena said, her voice steady but kind. I'm here for you. Marla stepped back slightly, wary but curious, and motioned her inside. Elena walked into the living room, glancing at the framed school portraits of Dylan from every awkward stage. Gap-toothed smile, crooked haircut, senior year with the cheap rental tux. I was at the quarterly staff meeting last month, Elena began, setting the folder on the coffee table. Your son spoke about his childhood, about being raised by a single mother who worked nights, cleaned classrooms, did whatever it took so he could focus on school. He said your sacrifices built the foundation he stands on. Marla's chest tightened. He told people that? Elena nodded. Not just told, he moved the room. There were tears. Mine included. She smiled faintly, brushing at her eye as though the memory still stung. I wanted to know more about the woman behind that story, so I did my homework, and then I reached out. Marla lowered herself slowly onto the couch. She hadn't expected to hear her life reframed as inspiration in some glossy boardroom. Dylan had once told her to never talk about her jobs at his school functions, embarrassed by her uniform. Now here was a stranger, saying her years of scrubbing floors had turned into applause lines. Elena opened the folder, sliding out a formal envelope edged in gold. The board decided you should be part of Dylan's celebration. You're the reason he succeeded. We'd like you to attend the promotion gala as our guest of honor. A few words, nothing long. Just you being there. Marla didn't take the envelope. Her hand hovered, then retreated. So he told my story for applause, she said quietly. Just not my presence. Elena's brow furrowed. I'm sorry? Nothing, Marla said, shaking her head, though her voice carried steel. She finally picked up the envelope, weighing it in her palm. It was heavier than it looked. At that moment, the side door banged open and Darlene Mitchell strolled in, clutching her sun hat like a shield against the glare. Lord, it's hot enough to fry an egg on the sidewalk, she announced, then stopped short at the sight of Elena. Well, hello. Who's this, Marla? Introductions were made, and as Elena excused herself with a handshake and a promise to follow up, Darlene plopped down in the armchair, eyes glittering. What's that you're holding? Marla held up the embossed invitation. Apparently, Dylan's company wants me at his big night. Darlene tilted her head. After he just told you not to come? Marla's mouth tightened. He shared my story. He just didn't want me in the room. Darlene snorted, shaking her head. Honey, he invited your work, not your worth. The words struck deep, echoing louder than the ticking clock in the hallway. Marla placed the invitation on the table, its gold edges catching the light like a dare. For the first time since last night's call, she didn't feel small. She felt seen, even if it was by strangers, not her own son. She glanced at the closed door where Elena had exited, then at her oldest friend sitting with arms crossed and eyes sharp as ever. Somewhere in between those gazes, a decision stirred. Marla reached for the envelope again, running her thumb over the seal. Her voice was low, but steady. If he thinks I don't belong, he's about to learn otherwise. The invitation sat unopened on Marla's kitchen table for a full day, its golden seal unbroken, like a dare she wasn't sure she wanted to take. By the next evening, she dragged herself to the same table with a pen and the back of an old envelope she'd pulled from the drawer. The paper was already smudged with grocery lists and phone numbers, but it was all she had in reach. She wrote his name first, Dylan. Just seeing it in her handwriting made her pause. She stared until the letters blurred. "All right," she whispered to herself. "If they want words, I'll give them words." Her hand moved slowly, almost grudgingly, as if each memory resisted being pulled onto the page. She wrote about the night Dylan had come home pale and sweating during finals week. Barely able to keep water down, he had cried, not because of the stomach flu, but because he feared missing his exam. Marla had wrapped him in blankets, slipped into her raincoat, and jogged to Walgreens through a storm to fetch ginger tea and saltines. She returned drenched to the bone, set a tray beside his bed, and told him the only test that mattered was proving he could survive the hard nights. The pen hovered above the paper. She tapped it twice, then underlined the sentence. "The hard nights make the strong mornings." "Good start," came Darlene's voice from the kitchen doorway. She had let herself in again, balancing a Tupperware of potato salad under her arm. "But it's sweeter than peach cobbler, and you know what sugar does. It makes people drowsy." Marla gave her a tired smile. "You're saying it needs teeth?" "I'm saying," Darlene said, setting the salad down with a thunk, "you need to add a little bite under the sugar. Don't let him, or anyone else, think you were just happy to play background music in his story. You built the whole stage." Marla's pen tapped harder. She scratched a new line under the old one. "I wasn't just his reason. I was his road." Darlene leaned over her shoulder, whistling low. "Now that'll wake the room up." Later that week, Elena Ward called to check in. Her voice carried the same polished composure as before, but there was a flicker of excitement beneath it. "We've got you slotted between the MC and the executive toast. You'll be seated near the board. Dylan still doesn't know. It'll be impactful." Marla's fingers tightened around the receiver. She looked at the unfinished speech, words scrawled in a shaky script, arrows pointing at sentences she couldn't decide to keep or cut. "I won't embarrass him," she said firmly, "but I won't disappear, either." When she hung up, she carried the envelope draft into the bathroom. She set it on the sink and faced the mirror. The overhead light was too bright, showing every line carved into her skin from years of long shifts and longer nights. She cleared her throat, then began to read aloud. Her voice wavered at first, the words stumbling as though they weren't sure they belonged in the air. She tried again, slower. "Dylan once told a roomful of people that I worked nights so he could study. That's true. But what he didn't say is that every mop I pushed, every floor I scrubbed, was a step he climbed. And that's nothing to be ashamed of, by either of us." She stopped, staring at her reflection. For a flicker of a moment, she almost didn't recognize herself. The set of her jaw, the way her shoulders drew taller as she spoke. Darlene called from the living room. "You practicing in there or reciting a hymn?" Marla smiled faintly. "Both, maybe." She read the lines again, louder this time, until the bathroom walls held the weight of her words. By the third attempt, her voice had steadied, no longer trembling. It carried something else instead, iron wrapped in velvet. When she lowered the paper, she met her own eyes in the mirror. They weren't the eyes of a woman embarrassed to show up. They were the eyes of someone preparing for a reckoning. She pressed the envelope draft flat against the glass, as if testing whether her words had the strength to reflect back at her. Her lips moved in silence, but the thought rang clear. He won't know what's coming until it's already said. Downtown Austin shimmered that night. The skyline cut sharp against a violet dusk. Glass towers glowed, and from the 32nd floor of the Halston Hotel, the rooftop bar gleamed like a lantern above the city. The sound of traffic below was faint, distant, as though the world had shrunk to this one glittering perch. Marla stepped out of the cab, smoothing the skirt of her navy dress. It wasn't new. She'd worn it to Darlene's granddaughter's graduation, but tonight she'd pressed it until every crease lay flat, polished her shoes until they reflected streetlight, pinned her hair with the careful precision of a woman who refused to let her age make her invisible. The doorman opened the glass door with a courteous nod. "Welcome, Ms. Green. They've been expecting you." She startled at the name, Ms. Green. She was used to ma'am at the grocery store, or honey from church ladies. but here she was being addressed with a respect that felt almost ceremonial. Inside, the rooftop bar stretched wide, its ceiling open to the stars. Fairy lights strung along glass railings. A jazz trio played softly in the corner, the notes weaving through the clink of wine glasses and low hum of conversation. A woman in black with a headset hurried toward her. "Ms. Green?" "Yes," Marla answered, steady but cautious. "I'm Kelsey, the event planner. We're so honored to have you tonight." She handed Marla a small card with neat type printed on it. "Your speaking notes, just in case. You'll be introduced after the toast." Marla slipped the card into her clutch without looking. She didn't need it. The words she carried weren't typed on cardstock. They were carved into her bones. Kelsey smiled, gestured toward the far end of the terrace where executives mingled under a cluster of golden lanterns. "We'll seat you right near the board. Someone will cue you when it's time." Marla nodded, adjusting the strap of her purse on her shoulder. She had never stood in a space like this before. No mop in hand, no name tag pinned to her chest. And yet, as the night breeze brushed her face, she felt less out of place than she had feared, until she saw him. Across the room, Dylan stood with a cluster of colleagues, his suit perfectly tailored, his laugh polished to match the clink of crystal in his hand. The easy charm that made him magnetic in these settings was on full display until his eyes landed on her. For a moment, he froze. The glass stopped halfway to his lips. His jaw tightened, and the practiced smile slipped. Marla felt the air shift, though no one else seemed to notice. He blinked once, twice, as though doubting what he saw. She held his gaze, didn't flinch. Then Dylan excused himself abruptly from the group, weaving between waiters with champagne trays, cutting a line through the crowd. His shoulders were stiff, his pace brisk. Each step he took was charged with an urgency that drew attention even from those who didn't know what was happening. Marla's pulse quickened, but she didn't move. She adjusted the hem of her dress with deliberate calm, as though she had all the time in the world. By the time Dylan was halfway across the room, faces were beginning to turn, curious at his sudden focus. Marla could see it in him, his fight to plaster back the smile, his struggle to disguise the panic rising in his chest. The jazz trio slid into a sharper tempo, horns bright against the tension threading through the terrace. Marla kept her chin lifted. She had folded towels while her heart broke, scrubbed floors until her hands bled, walked into this building knowing he wished she'd stayed home. Whatever storm approached, she would not be the one to bend first. Dylan closed the distance, his eyes locked on hers, expression taut with disbelief and something darker beneath. Marla tightened her grip on her clutch, breath slow, steady. The night was no longer his stage alone. Dylan was 2 steps away from her when the MC tapped the microphone. The soft chatter dimmed into a low hush, the jazz trio falling silent mid-phrase. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC boomed, smiling toward the glittering skyline. "Tonight we celebrate not only a brilliant career milestone, but the people and stories that built it. And now, a surprise guest of honor, the reason Dylan Green became the man we know today." Dylan froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving him statue still. From across the terrace, Allison, perched elegantly in a champagne-colored dress, lifted her flute to her lips and promptly choked. The cough drew a ripple of startled glances. She fanned her face with her manicured hand, but her wide eyes never left Marla. Marla's heels clicked softly on the stone as she stepped forward. The path cleared before her, murmurs rustling like wind through a wheat field. Kelsey, the event planner, appeared at her side and pressed the microphone into her hand. "You're on," she whispered, eyes bright with anticipation. Marla held the mic steady, though her pulse drummed hard in her ears. The terrace light seemed hotter, harsher. For a breath, she nearly faltered. Then she saw Dylan, jaw tight, eyes wild, a silent plea buried under the polished mask he scrambled to reconstruct. And she knew this was not his story anymore. "Good evening," she began. Her voice carried farther than she expected. clear and resonant. A hush spread deeper, glasses stilled mid-air. Conversations died unfinished. My son once stood in front of this company and told you he was raised by a single mother who worked nights. That part is true. She paused, letting the weight settle. What he didn't tell you was what those nights cost. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She glanced toward Dylan, who shifted in place, lips pressed into a line so thin it nearly vanished. Allison clutched her flute tighter, her knuckles blanching. Marla turned her eyes back to the room. There were evenings when I came home so tired from cleaning classrooms that my legs shook. There were mornings I left before dawn, whispering prayers into the dark, that Dylan would hold on just one more day. I wasn't just his reason. Her voice softened, but the steel rang beneath it. I was his road. For a heartbeat, silence swallowed everything. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. Slow, deliberate. An older executive near the front table leaned forward, his face solemn, his gaze fixed on Marla as if she'd cracked something open in him. One by one, others followed. The sound swelled, applause rolling across the terrace until it filled the rooftop like thunder. Marla bowed her head briefly, gratitude in the gesture, but when she lifted her eyes, they found Dylan again. He wasn't clapping. His jaw had tightened to stone, and his fingers dug into the stem of his glass so hard she thought it might snap. Allison leaned close to him, whispering urgently, but he didn't seem to hear. His gaze never left Marla, and behind the polished VP exterior was something raw, something dangerous. Marla lowered the mic. "Thank you," she said simply, before handing it back to Kelsey. The applause lingered, trailing off in uneven waves. People turned toward her with curiosity, admiration, even awe. A woman in a sequined jacket mouthed, "Incredible." Someone else dabbed at their eyes. Marla exhaled slowly, her hand brushing against the clutch at her side. She had done it. She had spoken. And though she hadn't said everything she could have, hadn't laid bare every sacrifice, every humiliation, she had said enough to shift the ground under Dylan's feet. As she stepped back from the center, the jazz trio stumbled into a new tune. But the energy of the room was different now. The executives glanced at Dylan, then at her, calculating, reassessing. Dylan forced a smile, too sharp, too brittle. His lips moved as he leaned toward Allison, though Marla didn't need to hear the words. She saw it in his eyes, fury and fear in equal measure. She knew in that moment that this wasn't the end of her speech. It was the beginning of his unraveling. The applause hadn't fully died before they came. One woman in a sequined jacket pressed Marla's hands between hers, eyes shining. "You don't know me, but I feel like I know you now. That was..." Her voice caught, and she simply squeezed tighter. Then another man, tall and silver-haired, introduced himself as a board member. "Ms. Green, it's an honor. I'd very much like to hear more about your journey. Our industry doesn't talk enough about the scaffolding beneath success." Soon they were everywhere. Executives, employees, even guests who weren't sure who she was but knew they wanted to be near her. Questions poured in. What jobs had she worked? How had she managed it alone? What advice would she give young parents? Marla answered carefully, her voice steady but never boastful. She kept her stories grounded, early mornings, late nights, the power of showing up even when she had nothing left to give. Each detail seemed to weave her tighter into the fabric of the room. From the far end of the terrace, Allison sulked near the dessert table, stirring creme brulee with a spoon until the caramel cracked loud enough for nearby guests to turn. She forced a smile when eyes fell on her, but her glare at Marla was unmasked, simmering. Dylan, meanwhile, cut through the crowd like a storm in a tailored suit. "Mom," he hissed when he finally reached her side. But before he could pull her aside, Elena Ward appeared, calm, deliberate, immovable. "Dylan," she said smoothly, sliding between them with a practiced grace. "Your mother is in high demand right now. Let's not disrupt the momentum." He bristled, jaw flexing, but Elena's eyes left no room for argument. She turned her attention back to Marla, as if Dylan had vanished. "We'd love a photo with the executive board, Ms. Green. The moment deserves to be remembered." Flashes popped seconds later, Marla flanked by men and women in sleek suits. Her navy dress plain by comparison but radiant under the camera lights. She smiled without strain, her posture upright, her presence undeniable. In the corner, Darlene watched with the kind of smug satisfaction only a lifelong friend could summon. She sipped her champagne slowly, lips curling. "Well," she muttered to herself, "ain't this something?" The photo session spilled into more conversation, laughter, connections. A vice president leaned in conspiratorially. "We're hosting our annual leadership brunch next month. Would you be willing to speak there? A short address, 5, maybe 10 minutes. We need voices like yours." Marla hesitated, the champagne flute trembling faintly in her hand. She glanced toward Dylan. He stood stiff, arms crossed, watching the exchange unfold like a man cornered at his own party. Her instinct was to say no, to step back before the night pulled her further into a spotlight she'd never asked for. But then she thought of the Walgreens run in the rain, of the coins she'd counted to buy him graph paper, of the phone call that had nearly erased her from this night altogether. She turned back to the VP and said, her voice even, "Yes, I'd be honored." The VP grinned, relief plain. "Wonderful. We'll be in touch." A fresh round of applause broke out near the photo area, as if the announcement itself had carried. Cameras caught the moment, and Marla could feel the shift. A cementing of her place in a space Dylan had once told her she didn't belong. At the dessert table, Allison's spoon snapped against the porcelain cup. She dropped it back into the dish with a clatter, muttering something sharp under her breath. Dylan's eyes never left Marla. He didn't smile. He didn't clap. But when their gazes locked across the terrace, she recognized the look, the same one he'd had as a boy when a test went badly, when he feared she knew more than he wanted her to. Only now it wasn't shame, it was fury. Marla held his stare, refusing to be the one to look away. The night had gotten away from him, and there was no reining it back in. She lifted her glass in a subtle toast, not to him, but to herself, and Dylan's hand, tight around his own drink, finally cracked the stem in two. Marla's phone buzzed the next morning as she was rinsing her coffee cup in the sink. She recognized the number instantly and let it ring once, twice, before finally answering. "Mom," Dylan's voice was clipped, cold. The professional mask he wore at work bleeding into the tone he used with her. "Yes, Dylan," a sharp breath through the receiver. "What the hell was that last night?" Marla dried her hands with the towel hanging on the oven door, took her time. "That," she said evenly, "was gratitude, something you forgot. You ambushed me." His voice spiked, then dropped quickly, as if he realized he was slipping into the raw register of a son instead of the polished cadence of an executive. "You humiliated me in front of everyone. Do you understand the position you put me in?" Marla leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the backyard where the roses sagged in the early sun. "No, Dylan, you buried me. I just stood back up." There was silence on the other end. But it wasn't empty. She could hear his shallow breathing, the way his anger crowded the line like static. "You should have stayed out of it," he muttered finally. "This was my moment." Marla closed her eyes. "Your moment was never just yours." The silence stretched again. Then came the click, the flat, final end of the call. He hadn't said goodbye. He hadn't said anything at all. She set the phone down carefully on the counter, but her hand lingered there, palm pressed against the cool surface. A part of her wanted to crumble. Another part, the stronger part, simply inhaled and reminded herself that she had survived worse storms than her son's anger. By late afternoon, a delivery van pulled up outside. The driver carried a vase tall enough to swallow her arms, filled with white lilies and a scattering of deep red roses. Tucked into the arrangement was a cream-colored envelope. She opened it, expecting Dylan's name, some half-hearted apology scribbled under duress. Instead, she read Elena Ward's neat handwriting. "Your presence changed the room." With admiration, Elena. Marla traced the words with her finger, a warmth rising in her chest she hadn't felt in years. Not pride exactly, but recognition. That evening, Darlene dropped by with a bag of takeout and a bottle of sparkling cider. She spotted the flowers on the table immediately. Well, somebody's trying to get in your good graces. Elena sent them. Darlene raised her brows, then grinned. Now that's a woman who knows power when she sees it. She set the takeout down, unpacking cartons of sesame chicken. So, how'd the golden boy react? Marla hesitated, then recounted the call. Dylan's clipped tone, his accusation, his silence. Darlene listened, chewing thoughtfully, her fork pausing mid-air. When Marla finished, her friend leaned back in her chair, eyes sharp. You didn't raise a bad man, Darlene said firmly. You raised one who forgot who built him. There's a difference. He's not rotten. He's just blinded by the shine of his own reflection. Marla looked down at the carton in her hands, her appetite gone. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe her son was still in there somewhere, buried under the polish, the ambition, the shame he couldn't quite shed. But then she remembered the glass stem breaking in his hand, the fury in his eyes, and she wasn't sure. Darlene reached across the table, giving her hand a squeeze. Don't let his forgetting erase your truth. You took your place last night, and no amount of his sulking can shove you back out. Marla nodded slowly, her grip tightening around her friend's hand. She wanted to believe that too. The lilies perfumed the room, their scent filling every corner of the house. But as the night deepened and the shadows crept longer, Marla couldn't shake the thought that flowers wilt, no matter how beautiful they begin. And her son's silence felt like the first petal falling. 3 days later, Marla woke to the chime of her phone. Not a call this time, notifications. Dozens of them. Still groggy, she slipped on her glasses and tapped the screen. Her feed was flooded with tags. A video, shared by the company's official account, was everywhere. It was the rooftop gala. The camera panned across the skyline, the golden glow of the terrace, and then settled on her Marla Green, in her navy dress, standing at the microphone. Her voice, steady and resolute, carried over the speakers. I wasn't just his reason. I was his road. The post had gone live overnight. The caption reading, "Every success has a root." Last week we honored Vice President Dylan Green and the woman who shaped him. Marla's thumb hovered over the pause button, but the comments scrolling beneath pulled her in. That's Ms. Green. She used to mop my classroom floor every morning. Always smiled, even when kids tracked in mud. She kept the hallways clean at Dawson Elementary. I remember her telling me, "Don't give up on yourself, kid." I never forgot that. I was a teacher at that school. This woman deserves more credit than anyone knows. Names she hadn't seen in decades filled the thread. Former students, parents, colleagues. Their words stitched together a tapestry of recognition she never thought she'd live to see. She scrolled and scrolled, each line striking deeper. Grit, kindness, strength, dignity. Her phone buzzed again, an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Ms. Green, a woman's voice, warm and professional. My name is Candace Miller. I run a nonprofit here in Austin called Bridge Forward. We help single mothers re-enter the workforce after time away. We saw the video and, well, we saw you. Would you consider speaking with our program participants? Maybe helping us design a training series? Marla pressed a hand to her chest, as if steadying herself. I'm not a professional, she said carefully. I've just lived a life. That's exactly what we need, Candace replied. The moms don't need another lecture. They need someone who's walked their road, someone who made it through. Marla's eyes burned. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. I'll do it, she said softly. I'd be honored. Candace's relief was audible. Thank you, Miss Green. You'll change lives. When the call ended, Marla sat for a long while in her quiet kitchen, phone still in her hand, the lilies from Elena drooping in the corner. For years she had been the invisible one, the woman who swept up after others, who kept her head down. And now strangers were calling her to lead. By afternoon, the video had spread beyond the company page. Local outlets reposted it. Comments multiplied. But tucked between the praise were new threads, shorter, sharper. Why is the VP's mom stealing the spotlight? This is supposed to be Dylan Green's achievement, not hers. Feels like a stunt. Wonder who arranged it. Marla knew instinctively where that bitterness came from. Dylan's handprints weren't visible, but the smear of his anger was clear. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Darlene. "Girl, you're trending. Don't let him scare you back into the shadows. This is bigger than him now." Marla set the phone down, her hand trembling. Darlene was right. The applause, the video, the comments, none of it belonged to Dylan anymore. They belonged to the truth she had finally spoken out loud. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the late afternoon sun dip across her yard, casting long shadows over the roses she had tended for years. A strange calm settled in her chest. Her life had been lived in corners, in the background, in service. But the world had turned toward her now, and she could no longer retreat. Still, she knew one thing with certainty. Dylan wouldn't let this stand. He would try to erase her again, and this time it would not be just silence on the other end of the line. By Monday morning, Dylan had clearly moved from sulking to strategy. The company's highlight reel vanished from their official page, deleted without explanation. A corporate memo circulated instead, bland and polished, congratulating the leadership team on a successful gala, with no mention of her name. Marla only knew because Darlene called, fuming. "They wiped you right off the page. Like you didn't exist. Like you didn't stand there and own that whole damn night." Marla, who had been trimming roses at the kitchen table, set the shears down with deliberate calm. "That's Dylan," she murmured. "Erase what he doesn't like. Pretend it never happened." But the erasure didn't stick. Later that afternoon, Elena Ward phoned her directly. "I fought it," Elena said flatly. "The board wanted the video down, said it was creating complications. I told them the story belongs to you. Not Dylan, not the company. You." Marla swallowed, caught off guard by the conviction in Elena's voice. "They didn't like seeing me? They didn't like seeing him overshadowed." Elena's tone sharpened. "But it's too late for them. The clip was shared, reshared, and archived before they ever hit delete. It's out in the world now, and the world isn't letting it go." That truth proved itself the next day. The Austin Chronicle ran a headline above the fold. "VP's mother stole the show at corporate gala." The article didn't just recap her speech. It painted her as a symbol of resilience, a quiet hero whose story resonated far beyond one company's rooftop party. There was even a photo, her hand on the microphone, the skyline behind her, Dylan in the blurred background with a face that seemed more strained than celebratory. Marla set the paper down slowly, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Her email pinged that afternoon. She opened it to find a message from Allison. The subject line read, "Family Boundaries." The text was short, sharp, and dipped in honey. "Marla, while we appreciate your enthusiasm for Dylan's career, it's important to remember that these are professional milestones. Families should celebrate in private, not insert themselves into events that are not about them. We hope you'll respect our boundaries going forward." Allison Marla stared at the words until they blurred. A lifetime of biting her tongue pressed against her chest. Then, for once, she didn't bite. Her fingers moved steadily across the keys. "Allison, you drew the boundary first. I simply stopped standing behind it." Marla. She hit send before doubt could creep in. That evening, Darlene came by with pie, dropped onto Marla's couch with her shoes kicked off, and waved the Chronicle in the air. "Well, honey, they can't scrub you now. You're in print." She flipped to the photo with a grin. "This one ought to sting." Marla chuckled softly, the sound surprising even herself. But Dylan wasn't laughing. Word trickled back through Elena a few days later. He'd been instructed by the board to attend media relations training. Image rehab, she called it. They want to make sure he doesn't look like the sulking son while you're trending as the city's favorite mother. Marla blinked at the phrasing. Sulking son. Dylan, the boy who once clung to her waist before his first day of kindergarten. Now reduced to an executive caricature of wounded pride. 2 mornings later, her phone rang again. A number out of New York this time. A podcast producer introduced himself quickly, his tone buoyant. "We feature voices that cut through noise, Ms. Green. We saw your speech. It's not just a story, it's a message. Would you consider coming on our show? Millions of listeners. We cover everything." Marla's throat caught. She pressed the phone harder to her ear, trying to picture herself not in a kitchen or a school hallway, but speaking to strangers across the country. "I'm not sure I'm the kind of person people tune in for," she said. "Oh, I think you're exactly the kind," the producer insisted. "Think about it. We'd be honored." When she hung up, she sat in silence, the newspaper still spread across her table. Allison's email glowing faintly in her inbox. Elena's faith steady in her memory. She was no longer just a mother who had shown up at the wrong party. She was a voice being asked to echo farther than she ever imagined. Marla brushed her hand across the headline, the ink faintly smudging her fingertips. For the first time, she felt the pull of a tide bigger than family, bigger than Dylan. And she knew with bone-deep certainty, Dylan would try again. He couldn't delete her from the world, but he would fight to delete her from his. By the end of the week, word reached Marla through Elena again. Dylan had turned down a keynote speaking opportunity at a major leadership conference. The offer had been his for months, a golden step towards cementing himself as a voice in the industry, but the board had quietly added a condition. They wanted his remarkable family story incorporated. Specifically, they wanted her there. He refused outright, Elena told Marla over the phone. Her voice clipped with disappointment. Not just refused, he raged. Called it a distraction, said he wouldn't let a personal detail hijack his professional reputation. Marla sat at her kitchen table, the paper from the Chronicle still folded nearby, the podcast request still unanswered. She could picture Dylan's face, the controlled smile, the stiff shoulders. How furious he must have been to realize the very story he once used for applause had outgrown his control. That evening, Allison called. Not to soften the blow, but to sharpen it. "You've hijacked his career, Marla." Her voice was tight, clipped, as if holding back venom. He worked for decades to separate himself from all that. And now everywhere he turns, it's your face, your words, overshadowing him. "Do you know how humiliating this is for him?" Marla closed her eyes, steadying her breath. "No, Allison," she said, her tone calm but edged. "I didn't hijack anything, I carried it. For 30 years. Every grade, every suit, every opportunity. My hands were beneath it. I carried him when he couldn't carry himself." The silence on the line throbbed with Allison's indignation, then a scoff. "You always make yourself the martyr." "No," Marla corrected quietly. "I made myself the road. He just doesn't like being reminded that he didn't pave it himself." She ended the call before Allison could fire back, setting the phone down with a finality that made her pulse race. Later that night, Darlene dropped in unannounced, as she always did, bringing 2 slices of pecan pie from a diner off the highway. She set the box on the counter and leaned back against the sink. "Well, I heard your boy stomped on his golden ticket," she said, folding her arms. "Couldn't handle sharing the spotlight." Marla gave a small shake of her head. "They wanted me there. He said no." Darlene's laugh was dry as dust. They hate the taste of humble pie, especially when it's served cold. Marla allowed herself the faintest smile. It faded quickly, though, when she thought of the conference audience that would never hear Dylan's speech, the doors quietly closing on him while others opened in her direction. 2 days later, a package arrived on her porch. Inside was a slim velvet box, the kind that usually carried jewelry. Instead, nestled in satin, was a heavy silver pen. The engraving gleamed. Legacy. Title a card tucked beneath read simply, "With gratitude, the board." Marla lifted the pen carefully, turning it in her hand. She could almost feel the weight of all the names she'd written on grocery lists, permission slips, utility checks. Her handwriting had traced Dylan's entire life, from his first crayon scribbles to the neat block letters on college applications. She rose from her chair and walked to the hallway shelf where she kept keepsakes too personal to throw away. Layla's old finger paintings, a faded church program, Dylan's report cards folded and worn from years of handling. She set the pen down beside one marked 10th grade. In red ink, it read, "Needs improvement. Potential is there, but inconsistent effort." Her fingers lingered on the paper. She remembered that year well. The stomach flu, the finals, the nights he'd nearly quit. She had carried him through it all. Now, staring at the pen, she realized the board had given her something Dylan never had. Recognition that what she carried mattered. Marla stepped back, arms crossed, the engraved words glinting beneath the hallway light. Legacy greater than title. Her son was about to learn that truth the hard way. The call from Elena came on a Wednesday afternoon while Marla was kneeling in her garden, pulling weeds from the base of her roses. "Elena Ward," the voice said warmly when Marla answered. "I have a proposal, and I hope you'll hear me out before saying no." Marla brushed dirt from her palms, wary but listening. "The board has been reevaluating our employee policies. Family leave, flexible hours, diversity, all of it. After the gala, after you, we realized we've been drafting these policies from glass offices without listening to the people on the ground. We want you to consult with us, just one afternoon a week. Your perspective matters." Marla stared at the roses, half in bloom, half fighting for survival. "I've never worked in an office like yours," she said slowly. "Exactly," Elena replied. "That's why you're the one we need." Marla thought of the silver pen gleaming on her shelf, engraved with the words "Legacy" title. For years she had been written out of the story. Now they wanted her to write it back in. "All right," she said finally, "I'll do it." Her first afternoon at the company felt surreal. She wore her best blazer, the one she'd bought secondhand for Dylan's college interviews, and stepped into the glass tower downtown with a folder clutched tight against her chest. They set her up in a bright conference room with a stack of policy drafts. The language was sterile, lifeless. She uncapped the silver pen and began scribbling notes in the margins. Instead of "employees are encouraged to request accommodations," try "employees deserve support." Respect doesn't start with permission, it starts at the root. A week later, she stood before a group of mid-level managers and HR staff, leading the first workshop she'd titled "Respect Starts at the Root." Her voice was measured, her stories specific. The nights she'd juggled shifts, the times she'd seen workers overlooked, the truth that no ladder stands without someone steadying the bottom. They listened, really listened, not with polite nods, but with pen scratching, eyes intent, questions spilling after the session ended. By the second workshop, the seats were full. By the third, they brought in employees from other departments just to hear her speak. Marla left each time exhausted, but with a strange buoyancy she hadn't felt in years. She was building something again, not for Dylan this time, but for herself, and for all the unseen hands holding others up. Not everyone was pleased. On her third week, she spotted Dylan in the hallway outside the conference room. He was heading the other direction, phone to his ear, but when he caught sight of her, he faltered. For a split second, his expression cracked, surprise, anger, maybe even shame. Then he looked down, pivoted sharply, and ducked into another corridor without a word. The sting was brief, quickly replaced by steel. If he wouldn't meet her eyes, she'd keep speaking to those who would. At home that weekend, Allison's email arrived. "Dylan is under enormous pressure right now. This role you've taken on, it's disruptive. You need to put a stop to it before it damages his career further. For his sake, please step back." Marla read it twice, then set it aside without replying. For decades she had bent herself into silence, for his sake. Not anymore. That evening, Darlene came over with 2 root beers and a grin. "So I hear you're running workshops now. Corporate darling. Look at you, changing policies in heels." Marla shook her head, smiling faintly. "I don't know if darling's the word." "They adore you," Darlene said, popping her bottle cap against the table. "And you know what? That eats at him more than anything. He can't erase you in here anymore. You're written into the walls." Marla sat back, the fizz of root beer crackling in her glass, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. She had become the voice Dylan never expected her to be. But as she stared out her window at the darkening street, she couldn't shake the feeling that his silence was only the calm before something sharper. Quarterly reviews at Halston Consulting were a blood sport dressed in silk. Executives filed into sleek conference rooms with binders of charts, polished slides, and bright words for dark numbers. Dylan had always thrived in these sessions, confident, crisp, spinning shortcomings into strategy like a magician turning scraps into silk scarves. But this time, the numbers refused to bend. Marla didn't sit in on the audit itself. She only heard the rumblings after, voices trailing through the hallways. Snippets carried by assistants who didn't realize the walls had ears. Words like stagnation, plateau, not pulling his weight compared to peers. By late afternoon, Elena stopped by the small conference room where Marla had just finished a workshop. She leaned in the doorway, arms folded, expression heavy. He didn't take it well. Marla set her pen down, bracing herself. "Dylan? He's been coasting," Elena said, her tone blunt but not unkind. "The board sees it, clients see it, and with you in the spotlight, the contrast, it doesn't help him." Marla's stomach twisted. She had never wanted her presence to become his downfall, but she also knew Dylan's wounds were largely self-inflicted. "Elena," she asked cautiously, "what do you mean he didn't take it well?" Elena hesitated, then gave a rueful smile. "We recommended a mentor, someone who could help him reframe his approach, stop treating leadership as a performance, and start treating it as service. The board suggested you." Marla's breath caught. "Me?" "I agreed," Elena said simply. Across the building, in a different conference room, Dylan's voice erupted loud enough to carry through glass walls. "I don't need her approval." Chairs scraped, papers rustled. The kind of chaos that usually followed after someone broke the unspoken rule of never losing composure in front of HR. Marla heard about his outburst from a shaken young manager later that day. He looked like he was ready to tear the table apart, red in the face, said his mother was the last person qualified to tell him anything about leadership. When HR called her in the next morning, Marla walked down the hall with her chin high, though her stomach churned. The panel waited for her, polite but probing. "You've had an influence here," one of them said. "People respond to you. We'd like to hear your perspective. What do you think Dylan needs in order to move forward?" Marla thought carefully before answering. She could have unleashed every hurt, every slight, every scar he'd carved into her pride. Instead, she spoke with the same clarity she had at the gala. "He'll never grow until he stops climbing over people," she said. "You can't build a career on other people's backs and expect it to last. Leadership isn't about who's above. It's about who you carry with you." The room went quiet. Finally, the head of HR nodded. "Thank you, Miss Green. That's exactly what we needed to hear." She walked out with her heartbeat steadying, the silver pen heavy in her purse. For the first time, she hadn't been speaking as a mother defending her son. She'd been speaking as someone who understood the roots of resilience better than any of them. That evening, she learned the board's decision. Dylan's quarterly bonus had been withheld. It wasn't catastrophic, not yet, but it was a public crack in the armor of a man who had built his life on looking untouchable. Marla sat at her kitchen table that night, Darlene across from her with a mug of tea. She relayed the events in clipped sentences, not gloating, not grieving, just laying the truth bare. Darlene stirred her tea slowly. "So they finally saw through the shine," she said. "Well, took 'em long enough." Marla didn't answer. She stared at the engraved pen on the shelf. At the report card beneath it, at the growing proof that her voice carried power, Dylan could no longer mute. For the first time in years, she felt a storm shifting. And this time, it wasn't inside her. It was in him. The knock on Marla's door came on a Saturday afternoon, sharp and uncertain, like someone unsure whether they even wanted to be there. When she opened it, she found Layla, her granddaughter, standing on the porch with her hands jammed into the pockets of a sweatshirt, too big for her. "Hi, Grandma," Layla said, her voice low. "Layla." Marla softened. She hadn't seen her in weeks, not since the gala. The girl looked taller, her eyes shadowed with questions she hadn't learned how to hide. "Come in, sweetheart." They sat at the kitchen table. The silence stretched long, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Layla twisted the drawstring of her hoodie before blurting it out. "Dad said you embarrassed him." The words hung between them, sharp as glass. Marla took a slow breath, steadying herself. She could have deflected, could have changed the subject, but she knew this was the moment. "Did he tell you," she asked gently, "who bought his first suit?" Layla's brow furrowed. "No." "It was me," Marla said. "I saved grocery money, skipped meals, worked an extra weekend shift. I bought him that suit so he could walk into his interviews looking like he belonged. He never knew I pawned my wedding ring to cover the last bit." Layla blinked. "He didn't tell me that." "No," Marla said softly. "He doesn't tell the hard parts, just the shiny ones." The kitchen grew quiet again, but the silence felt different this time, charged, expectant. Finally, Marla stood. "Help me with something?" Layla shrugged. "Sure." They moved into the kitchen, pulling ingredients from cupboards in the fridge. Flour, sugar, bananas gone soft with freckles. Marla tied an apron around her waist, then another around Layla's, and together they started to mash, stir, pour. It was awkward at first. Layla fumbled with the mixer, spilled flour on the counter. Marla corrected her gently, with patience born of decades spent caring for others. As the batter came together, so did the conversation. Marla told stories about Dylan studying late into the night, about the time he nearly quit school and she talked him back from the edge. She didn't sugarcoat it. She spoke of exhaustion, of fear, of pride that sometimes hurt more than hunger. Layla listened, her eyes fixed on the bowl as she stirred, her lips pressed tight. By the time the banana bread was in the oven, the kitchen smelled warm and sweet. They sat again at the table, sipping milk as the timer ticked down. Layla finally spoke, her voice cracked and low. "I thought he just did it all himself." "That's what he always says." Marla reached across the table, covering her granddaughter's hand with her own. "No one does it all themselves, Layla. Don't ever believe that lie." When the timer dinged, they pulled the bread from the oven. They cut slices while it was still steaming, butter melting across the top. Layla bit into hers and let out a small laugh through her tears. "It's good. It's ours," Marla said quietly. When it came time to leave, Layla hugged her grandmother tight at the door. It wasn't the quick, polite squeeze of obligation. It was longer, clinging. Marla felt the dampness of her tears against her shoulder. "Thank you," Layla whispered. Before pulling away and hurrying down the walk, Marla stood in the doorway, watching her granddaughter go, her heart both aching and mending all at once. Later that night, she sat at her desk with a legal pad and her reading glasses perched low on her nose. She began drafting updates to her will, nothing fancy, just words on lined paper for now. A conditional clause, something that would leave Layla secure, but only if she chose a life built on honesty, on remembering the root instead of burying it. Her pen slowed as she wrote the final line. She pressed the tip hard, etching the words deep into the paper as if to ensure they couldn't be erased. The branch bends, but it does not break. Marla set the pen down, staring at the document in the lamplight. Her son had tried to sever her from his story, but her granddaughter had reached for her, and in that reaching, Marla found the one branch of the family tree still strong enough to carry her legacy. The invitation arrived on thick cardstock, embossed with gold letters that caught the light when Marla turned it in her hands. Community Resilience Award Ceremony, it read. Her name was printed beneath the title, crisp and impossible to ignore. She almost did ignore it. The idea of standing in front of another crowd, of becoming once again the subject instead of the silent hand behind someone else's story. It felt too strange, too exposed. But then Layla called. I want to be there, her granddaughter said softly. If you go, I'll sit with you. That was enough. The ballroom was draped in white and gold, chandeliers scattering light across polished tables set with silverware she hadn't seen since wedding banquets in another lifetime. Marla sat near the stage, her dress plain but pressed, her silver hair pinned neatly back. Layla slipped into the seat beside her, her hands small and steady in Marla's lap. From the back of the room, in the corner shadows, Marla caught a glimpse of him. Dylan. His frame stiff, his suit immaculate as always, but his posture coiled tight, as though he wasn't there to celebrate but to endure. He didn't approach. He didn't smile. The ceremony moved briskly, introductions, applause, a handful of speeches that blurred together. Then the MC's voice rang out. And now, our final honoree this evening, Marla Green, a woman whose strength reminds us that every success story has roots. Ms. Green, please join us on stage. Layla squeezed her grandmother's hand before letting go. Marla rose slowly, the spotlight following her across the room. Applause rose, a low tide swelling into thunder, but she walked with measured steps, neither rushing nor bowing beneath it. At the podium, the microphone loomed. She rested her hand against its edge, steadying herself before speaking. I was asked to give a long speech, she began, her voice carrying through the hushed ballroom. But I think life is long enough, so I'll keep it short. A ripple of laughter softened the air. She continued. People talk about climbing ladders, about reaching the top. But ladders don't stand on their own. Someone has to hold them steady at the bottom. Often without thanks, often without recognition. I've held a few ladders in my time, and I've learned this. Success isn't just about who climbs, it's about who steadies. The room grew still, the kind of stillness that comes when words press straight against the truth. I didn't do what I did for applause. I did it because love requires labor. And I stand here now not because I needed this award, but because maybe some of you needed the reminder. The roots matter as much as the branches. She bowed her head slightly. Thank you. The applause erupted again, rolling across the hall in waves. Layla clapped the loudest, eyes shining as she leapt up to hug her grandmother when she returned to the table. But not everyone clapped. Marla felt it like a cold draft in the room, the stillness from the back corner where Dylan stood. He hadn't moved, hadn't brought his hands together once. His face was carved from stone, watching but refusing to join. Darlene slid into the seat across from Marla, her grin wide, her champagne glass raised. Told you the universe would spin back, she whispered, her eyes twinkling. Elena appeared next, leaning down so only Marla could hear. You changed how we see the ladder, not just here, everywhere. Don't underestimate that. Marla smiled, a small, quiet curve of her lips. She didn't need the award, the applause, the chandeliers, but she knew she had earned every bit of it. And as she looked at Layla, hand warm in hers, Marla realized the honor wasn't just for her past. It was for the future she had refused to let break. From the shadows, Dylan shifted, his eyes narrowing, his silence heavier than any words. Marla held her granddaughter's hand tighter, feeling the weight of his gaze. The award gleamed on the table in front of her, but it wasn't what she focused on. It was the storm building in the corner, the one she knew hadn't yet reached its peak. The text came at dawn, a thin blue glow spilling through Marla's bedroom curtains. You've made your point. Enough. Stop showing up where you don't belong. Her thumb hovered over the reply box, heat rising in her chest. She could have written back a dozen truths about sacrifice, about blindness, about love twisted into shame. But she didn't. With a slow breath, She pressed delete. The message vanished, leaving her screen blank. Later that morning, she carried the award from the ceremony into the hallway. Its brass plate gleamed under the light, heavy in her hands. She paused at the shelf where her most personal relics sat. Layla's finger painting, the silver pen from the board, Dylan's 10th grade report card, edges worn soft with years of folding and unfolding. She reached deeper into the box at the bottom of the shelf and pulled out a small laminated badge, scratched and faded from use, her custodian's badge, Dawson Elementary. Name printed in black block letters, green, M. She placed the award beside it. A lifetime apart in Polish, yet bound by the same truth. Both represented the work she had done, the weight she had carried, the labor that had mattered even when no one clapped. Her throat tightened, but not with sorrow, with recognition. The company's orientation day arrived a week later. A new batch of hires, fresh faces, bright clothes, eyes wide with the hope of proving themselves, filed into the atrium. Marla waited behind the curtain of the small stage, her navy blazer pressed, the speech cards Elena had insisted on tucked into her pocket. She didn't need them. The words weren't written on cardstock. They were written into her skin. The MC tapped the mic. And now, to speak on what it means to build a career with roots, please welcome Miss Marla Green. As she stepped into the light, the sound caught her off guard. Applause, before she had said a word. Dozens of hands clapping, some cheers cutting through. The kind reserved not for executives, but for someone who had earned respect by living it. She stood at the podium, resting her hands lightly on the wood, and let the room settle. I used to think the work I did didn't matter, she began, voice steady, mopping floors, emptying trash cans, cleaning classrooms long after the kids had gone home. I thought it was invisible. But invisible things, roots, foundations, scaffolding, they're the things holding everything else up. Remember that. Respect starts at the root. Heads nodded, pens scratched. She saw recognition flicker across faces, the kind she used to crave and never got. Now it arrived without her asking. When the session ended, the new hires surged forward, eager to shake her hand, to thank her. She smiled, listening more than she spoke, answering their questions with patience. Darlene was waiting by the lobby doors afterward, leaning on her cane with a grin that could have lit the whole atrium. Well, she drawled, now you're the one they name buildings after. Marla laughed softly, shaking her head. Don't be ridiculous. But as she turned toward the glass wall of the lobby, her breath caught. There, stretched across the marble in a newly painted mural, were the words, "Every success has a root." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "Inspired by Marla Green." Her chest tightened. She touched the glass lightly, as if to make sure the words wouldn't vanish, as if they might dissolve like chalk on a sidewalk. But they didn't. They were fixed, permanent. Behind her, the chatter of employees buzzed, footsteps echoing on the polished floor. But Marla's focus was on the mural, on the truth finally carved into a space that once would have locked her out. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket. She didn't need to look to know who it was. She silenced it, leaving it unopened. She had no more answers to give, because the world had already answered for her. As she walked out into the sunlight with Darlene at her side, she thought back to the words that had started it all, spoken in her son's clipped, dismissive voice. "Mom, it's better if you don't show up at my promotion party. You won't fit in with the guests." He didn't know she'd been invited as the guest of honor.